You know, the Child Convention is one of the now stand in a country that has a specific law on the Child Convention, but still we don't see any member state that actually says it's enough now. The children's rights alone will now make us do everything to work for a ceasefire. It's not important enough. And that goes, I think, for the whole human rights agenda. But I think it's specifically obvious when it comes to children's rights, because we see this daily suffering, the killings of children, the suffering of children. And yesterday we came with a report about children who've disappeared. These are staggering numbers that we can't accept, but still we find ourselves accepting it.
And since you are working as Secretary General for the Save Children, how can the UN and organizations like Save the Children collaborate more effectively?
I think we try to do that, and I think that information like the report we issued yesterday is one example that put these issues on the table. Save the Children's CEO in the United States briefed the Security Council when she had been in Gaza, for example, on what she saw there. I'm really happy to see that the Secretary General now has asked all the UN agencies to mainstream children's rights in all their work and in their budgets. And I think it's a very important, we pushed for that decision in the Executive Committee of the United Nations, and we're also going to monitor to see whether this is actually done. So there are many different ways where we work together, but perhaps more importantly in humanitarian work in countries like Gaza, where we work mostly with UNICEF, but not only, also with other UN agencies on the ground.
Perfect, thank you so much. Måns, from a human rights perspective, how do you see the UN's efforts align with OSA's views on helping children, for example, in war zones in Gaza or Ukraine?
I mean, we share very much what Jan has said, and OSA as well, regarding the not functioning of the United Nations. There are many aspects when it comes to preventing war where the UN has failed. I think that some of these failures also led to important reforms. So, for example, in '94 we had the genocide in Rwanda. In '95 was the Srebrenica, where the case of ethnic cleansing, and both of them were highlighted by the UN itself that it was a lack of early warning that was a problem inside the Security Council. It led to a discussion: can we have more of a horizon scanning exercise every month? They tried to set up something. It was discontinued by important members. Then came 2010, Sri Lanka, another dysfunctional intervention by the UN, and led to more institutionalized horizon scanning inside the Security Council. And it was discontinued, but then Jan made a fantastic initiative with something called the Human Rights Up Front, which institutionalized this kind of horizon scanning in the United system, but not strong enough. So it has not continued under Guterres. But there is a seed there to something that must happen in the Security Council. So when, for example, Denmark is stepping into the Security Council in January next year, this is one of our key recommendations.
So if we wouldn't have human rights violations, we also would have much lower numbers of refugees. And just to put it in perspective, today we have 120 million people in the world who've been forced to flee, either as internally displaced, so not crossed an international border, and that's actually the majority, 80 million, and 40 million who have become refugees, so crossed an international border. And 40% of these 120 million are children, just getting back to the children's rights. And of course, there are many reasons for flights, but the real underlying cause is human rights abuses and the failure to prevent conflicts from erupting.
And how well is the UNHCR handling or dealing with the growing number of refugees?
First time now in over 2 decades are turning down. So the sort of needle has shifted in the wrong direction. Because of COVID, because of climate, because of Ukraine, there's many reasons, but the evidence is clear that we're going in the wrong direction.
Okay, and what are the biggest challenges for UNHCR faces in helping refugees in dangerous areas?
So I think there's 3 really big challenges for us, and one goes back to the increase of human rights abuses and the lack of prevention, which means that these rising numbers, not only do they rise, also people don't return. So when I started working for UNHCR, I remember we were trained on doing something called tripartite agreements. So the tripartite agreements that I did, for example, was in regards to South Sudan. So we sat down with the hosting country, which was Ethiopia, with Sudan, the refugee-producing country at that time, and the South Sudanese, who were refugees and didn't have a nation. This was 2010. And we really wrote this agreement, you will go back and you can carry your windows, but not the roof, because, that was an area which is very dry and they didn't want the thatched roofs. You can take 5 cattle, they're going to be vaccinated like this. You can take the children with this and this vaccine. And it was a hugely optimistic time because these people were going home. And they left in millions. And I remember even I was working in a refugee camp at the time, and the South Sudanese were literally demonstrating outside the camp saying, if you don't provide trucks, we'll walk. And I was there saying, you walked here 16 years ago and you lost 2/3 of your population. Not a good idea, really not a good idea. But there was that sense of hope, and we want to go home, we want to rebuild our lives. Last year, only 1 million refugees returned home and 5 million IDPs. It's not nothing. But it is a very sharp decline in that kind of solution. So I think that's really the first challenge. The second challenge is relating to finances, because when we have people who are in exile for more and more years, and especially in countries where they're not allowed to work, which is the case for 70% of the world's refugees, then they become dependent very quickly on humanitarian assistance for no reason, no fault of their own. And we've been unable to really invest in people and in refugees and to give them agency, and I think that's really the second challenge. The third one, and this is my last one, is climate. So with the climate crisis, we see more and more people moving, mostly within their own borders, but we also see less and less people returning. So if you look even at Eastern Horn or the Sahel, both sides of Africa, we have growing deserts. And even when people move because of conflict, because that's still the main reason why they move, they are then unable to go home because they don't have any livelihoods to go back to. So that's the third sort of big challenge in front of us.
Thank you. Since you mentioned, and we all did mention actually, that 120 million people are actually refugees today, is there any new program that UNHCR are working with to help those refugees?
Yeah, so there's a few sort of lights at the end of the horizon, I would say.
Okay.
And one of them is really sort of the increased collaboration across the UN and between development actors and humanitarian actors. So the World Bank has opened a new sort of window that in the past 5 years have given something like 4 billion to refugee hosting countries. So not to UNHCR or say the children or any of the organizations, but really to the countries to include the refugees. And that's
like neighboring countries, yeah?
Like neighboring countries. And of course 75% of the world's refugees live in the neighboring countries. They're not in the north, they're not in Europe. So they live in countries like Kenya, like Turkey, like Bangladesh. In many countries that are actually quite poor and struggling themselves with development. So through this sort of World Bank loan, these countries are able to build water systems, health systems, etc., and really integrate the refugees. And here actually the IKEA Foundation has also played a huge role in countries like Kenya. And so the refugee camps, which used to be closed camps where nobody could escape from and nobody also could actually have a livelihood, are now being turned into municipalities. And that's kind of cool. That's sort of the last step, right? Until you get political rights and right to vote. And once you've got that, you're sort of settled and you can actually really become an agent of change yourself as a refugee, and you're no longer dependent on us or the UN or anyone else.
Thank you so much. John, how can the broader UN system better support the UNHCR in addressing these challenges, according to Nicholas?
Well, I want to just not leave the UN Security Council issues, if you don't mind. Because I think we need to have a new culture evolving, a culture of prevention. And I tried, I'm glad Måns mentioned this, and my view was that human rights violations are actually a sign of a conflict to come. If you look at the history of conflicts, you will see that human rights violations very much is a vibration in the ground that a conflict is coming. So I wanted to expand the agenda of the Security Council by introducing this program, Human Rights Up Front. Regretfully, I didn't have a resolution in the General Assembly with me on that, which is in contrast to the responsibility to protect, as you know, which was documented in the summit meeting 2005. But I felt that if they were to identify human rights violations as a reason for conflict, then they should act preventively before the war breaks out. And that qualitative steps has to be taken. If they don't take this, UN is in real trouble, because we cannot now divorce peace from development and human rights. It's a one agenda and it's integrated. And if we fail on one of these items, we fail on the whole. And this requires public opinion support. And also, I become more and more open about this. We should put a shame stamp on the use of the veto. They don't negotiate. I mean, I can understand logically why the US and Russia are not agreeing on Ukraine and Middle East and even Syria. But damn it, in Sudan, you have the most obscene war going on right now. Gaza, the most obscene conflict with an enormous failure of international law and international humanitarian law. And the Security Council could easily find a binding solution on Sudan. Where are the national interests in the US and Russia and China in Sudan? This shows the mistrust between major powers. And the UN is paying a price. The UN is in disrepute because of not acting in this case. On a more lighter note, not to make you too seriously worried about this, I had a lunch with the P5, the Permanent Five, after I left as President of the General Assembly, and I joked with them and said to them, why don't you become a negotiation body? You should sit down and negotiate a resolution. That's your job. Instead, you are lazy. You just produce a veto or a threat of a veto. And then a crazy idea came in my mind. I said, you should work like the Catholic Church when they select popes. You should lock yourself up in a room, and we should lock you behind, and then only when the white smoke comes out and you have negotiated a resolution can you come out. Not everybody appreciates that joke among the P5. But I'm saying that the Security Council has to shape up. If they don't, I think there has to be more movement in the direction of the General Assembly and the Secretary General. And then I want to commend UNHCR and others who have, under the most difficult circumstances now, worked in areas like Yemen, like Sudan, like Gaza, all over. I mean, the UN has lost almost 150 people, something like that, in Gaza and all over. Friends of mine have died. And still, UN is criticized. But UN is also the presence on the ground of great agencies who have done a great job for a lot of people. But I'm afraid now that UN has become put in such a position in the world where you look at globalists as a negative force. The conservative movements in Europe and the US have designed and designated the UN as an enemy. International cooperation and looking outward and sharing and international solidarity are, negative values in the political debate. So we have to watch out. What's going on right now in the world is a movement away from international cooperation, and I would say also a undermining of not only the international security order, look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also international law. I mean, Hamas, of course, horrible international crimes, but also Israel, the extent of violence used and the starvation and so forth. We should speak out on that. We should speak out, because if we don't, then we sort of say, next time, should we not speak out or not? I mean, we have established something which we are criticized more and more now from Africa and Asia and Latin America, of double standards. We cannot exercise double standards. And I think, Måns, for your work, it's absolutely crucial that you stand up for these values, like your work on also women's situation. Sorry.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, it's for us. It's a key concern. It's something of the most threatening trends to the international system of protection of individual rights. And if we take one step back, the shrinking space of liberal democracy and the rise of autocratic regimes, that is a major threat to the whole system of individual rights and civil liberties. But it's also the absence of countries willing to speak up against the autocrats is also a problem. So this, when it comes down to this engagement of member states, the role of small states to build strong coalitions to protest against the autocrats, that is key. And we've seen small states like Iceland, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Denmark, even Finland doing a great job, but Sweden is missing in action. Like I said, that Sweden should lead one cross-regional initiative, a country-specific initiative in the United Nations. They used to lead on Iran, they dropped it, but it's time for Sweden to step up and lead a new initiative. But the second is, yeah, I think that's a good idea. But when it comes to selective accountability or double standards, that is becoming more of an existential threat to the whole human rights system. And it's actually not something that's only the West is responsible for. I would like to emphasize that, because many of the countries that criticize the war crimes in Gaza, which are well documented by us, I think, they say nothing about China's crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. when the UN finally managed to vote through a monitoring mission in Sudan last year in October 2023 to collect evidence of the ample war crimes, not one single African country voted for. And that is a problem. That we are now calling on the African Union to, within the United Nations, support a civilian mission in Darfur, in Sudan, to collect evidence, protect civilians, and ensure that humanitarian aid can come through. But it's very difficult to mobilize. And for example, we saw how when the Darfur former President Bashir, he was able to travel freely, even if he had an arrest warrant on him. He was able to go to South Africa. Now South Africa is using the institutions of criminal justice to bring Israel for the International Court of Justice, which is totally fine. But the selective use of the accountability mechanism, it poses a threat. People don't believe that there are standards that apply for all, but they are just used selectively. So we need countries like Sweden to step up and show a more principled support of accountability.
So I do agree with, on that, and I think also that the breach between, if you like, the global north and the global south became bigger during COVID, when EU Western countries took vaccines for themselves first. I think also when Russia invaded Ukraine and actually literally used ODA for Ukraine at the expense of poor countries in the global south. I understand why it's important to support Ukraine. Definitely nothing against that, but I think that I know, since I was around these tables at the UN in New York, this was seen as taken from poor countries also in other conflicts during that time. And I think that that breach was also exploited many times in relation to this double standard, but in a different way. It's often said against the Beijing platform and the women's rights agenda, which is always seen as political. Children's rights are not, but women's rights are always seen as political, and that means relative. And it's by this breach also led to, by some of these autocrats, it made them skillfully, it gave them the possibility to accuse agreements like the Beijing agenda for being a Western agenda, which is definitely not true. These agendas were agreed with the whole world. Björn, who works with UNFPA over there, now responsible for humanitarian response and saves women's lives when they give birth in humanitarian settings, knows that the Cairo agenda and the Beijing agenda were agreements between all countries. But this is now very skillfully, and I think more skillfully than the Western countries, because they are often more criticizing and withdrawing their support, their political support and their economic support from the UN, and kind of leave that discussion and that description of reality there. I think, since we do have all the issues that we talked about, we have climate, we have poverty, we have crisis, we have energy issues, we have many problems that we need to solve globally. We have to invest again in the UN. We have to reset it also. Why I want a woman to lead it, that's very important, and I want those P5s with their smoke to be also women, both women and men. And I think that I don't see any other solution than to really reinvest both economically and politically, but then also ask for accountability from myself and from the others. I just don't really see any other way forward, because if we didn't have the UN, we would have to reinvent it. I can't see any other solution.
I wanted to come back to sort of what is the main threat. So I think there's sort of the 3 Ps, which I just made up, but I think they actually make a lot of sense, at least for me. So one is the polarization and the sort of fragmentation that we have in the world, both within countries, also between countries, where people don't talk to each other, they talk at each other at best, but sort of everyone's talking and nobody's really listening. The second one, and it's a bit ironic, after all everything else I've said, but really is pessimism. And I think, you know, the UN should be the narrative of hope, the hope of the possibility, what is possible. But when, you know, constantly confronted with more wars, more disasters, more climate change, all of that, it's hard to not be sort of beaten by the pessimism. And the third one really, and that's maybe the most important one, is the focus on problems. We're talking about problems all the time, and we're not talking about the solutions. And when we talk about problems, we often want to give just 3 very quick examples. So one is from the refugee field. So refugees are seen as a problem in many countries, including this one. And the answer is to build walls or to find other ways of decreasing the number of arrivals, or to send them somewhere else. Rwanda as one example. Of course, this doesn't actually solve the problem at all. It might win votes, but it does nothing to help anyone. And it doesn't solve the problem. The problem at best maybe shifts a little bit from one place to another. Beyond the refugee issue is all the talk about war. So I'm from Finland. It's a country that's been in war 3 times over the last 100 years, always with the same neighbor. But I'm relatively new in Sweden. I arrived about a year ago, and Sweden has not had a war for centuries. And yet, within a couple of weeks of arriving on my Facebook, I get all this get ready for war. You know, buy a flashlight, buy a rucksack, you know, purified water tablets. I'm like, where does this come from? And when people talk about war, they don't talk about peace. But the truth is that you have to talk about peace. You have to talk about ways to solve the war, not about the war spreading, because that becomes inevitable and it becomes in our mindset, and we just don't get out of that. And it's of course very possible that the war will spread. I'm not naive enough to think that, you know, just we shouldn't think about that. But if that's all we focus on, if we focus on, you know, more iron to the border as opposed to more talks about the border, then we're sort of in a never-ending negative spiral, and war becomes inevitable. The third, just quick example that I wanted to give from the refugee field. So when I was working in Turkey in 2010-2011, all the Syrian refugees were welcomed in Turkey very generously under a temporary protection regime that the Turks set up. But of course, in refugee law, for those of you who don't know, you can also be undeserving. And the principle is you include first and then you exclude. So as I had 119 lawyers working for me, they were interviewing the generals and officers that came over, because these were the potential people who, although very little had actually happened in Syria at the time, there were many human rights abuses committed by Assad's forces towards its own people. So these were the ones where we were interviewing them and asking, you know, what had they done to see if they would be excluded from refugee protection. And one of the generals I interviewed was very annoyed of being interviewed by a young woman. But when he got over that, he said, "Do you know how old Assad's son is?" And I said, "No idea." He said, "Do you know how long the war would last?" And this was the very beginning of the war. So it was, for those of you who remember, you know, it was all about the Arab Spring, you know, very, very positive times. Most people said 6 weeks, 3 months max, and he will be out of power and we will have democracy in Syria. And the general said, "Do you know how old Assad's son is?" And I said, "No." And he said, "He's 8. I was sort of thinking, I'm not quite sure what the relevance here is. And I said, and he said, "And that's how long the war will last. The war will last until he's 20 and he can give over." And it was very sad, because of course he's actually right, and that may be what will happen in Syria. But the point being, I think we need to think in generations. I think in the Western countries we're too fixated on the next election and the next year, and we don't think further enough ahead to actually be able to make those kind of changes that we need to make a difference.
Thank you so much. We've discussed many ideas today, from reforming the United Nations to better addressing human rights. But before we end, can each of you share one final thought on the future of the UN? Yeah, because we have just some few minutes left.
You know, I shift between, as I said, the worried optimist and the pessimist who has not yet given up. So I believe in the power of this charter. This is actually one of the best written documents in the world. And I hope to God we will not have to meet again and write a new charter. But I think what has to happen is a sense of responsibility, of prevention, accepting prevention, but also something else. The most important word in today's world, I read that in my book that just came out, is the word together. United Nations cannot solve this alone. You need not only the member states and parliaments, you need the civil society, we need the media, we need the private sector, we need research, we need all other actors. And if we will be able to communicate among ourselves and put the problem in the center, as I said earlier today, and water is indeed a very important problem. If we can gather around the problem and then find a division of labor among us and share the responsibility. We cannot just point to the UN, now you fix this, although I put my finger to the Security Council. We need to really do it together and mobilize the good forces. And I say, we are in a hurry. I think we have a shifting trend. All my life, since I started as a kid in school and then into the ministry and everything else, and UN, I have seen a positive force all the time. Democracy gaining ground, international cooperation gaining ground. Since the last 5-6 years, I see a strong negative strain. And to see that we are on the defensive. And we need to bring in new energy, new ideas, and in spite of the conditions around us, never lose faith. Never lose faith. Never give up. But remember, this is a time in history where we have to mobilize good forces.
Thank you so much. Well, Åsa?
Yeah, I think I said I do believe in the UN with all its problems, and I think it is important to reset and reinvest. I think I totally agree with you that we all need to work together, partnerships, civil society, private sector, academia, and everyone. That's also part of the Sustainable Development Goals. But I think the world is on fire. I think a small country, as you pointed out, as Sweden, we have the population of New York. We can really also, that's not the purpose, but we can really use the UN if we want to, for good purposes, to take important initiatives and to actually work both with our development support, with foreign policy, policies which are beneficial for the situation, and be very interesting in the world, have influence that we had, but that we right now maybe don't seem to be as interested in. I think that's important. And my last point is come together, stop the war in Gaza for the sake of children.
Måns, you have already mentioned that UN has to take its accountability.
Yes,
question, yeah.
Yeah, accountability, early warning, functioning Security Council. I would like to say that, I mean, there is a summit actually for the future. The summit, it's upcoming in September, and it really puts the United Nations to the test. Can they deal with the issues that people care about? They will talk about important challenges in AI, talk about the threat of developing fully autonomous weapons, they will talk about the right to environment, but also this important notion of a human rights economy that human rights, the High Commission of Human Rights is more and more talking about. How can you have an economy that enables investment in health, in education, in social protection? So these are key elements, and if we can get a successful summit of the future, that will also boost the relevance of the UN.
September. And Annika, welcome.
So, I agree with everything that has been said. I also think, going back to the Charter, which starts with we the people, and I really think that's sort of the key ingredients. And I think if you look at any progress that's been made, it's been made through agency given to people. Women's rights, children's rights, refugee rights, all are still in it's very infancy. That agency, that sort of feeling that I can change my own future, I think that's what we need to sort of get back to, because that is a little bit lost. You know, there's all these debates going on and we all feel like they're going way over our head and people aren't really listening. But if you listen to, so I have young daughters myself, and you listen to what they say on issues that matter to them, on climate, on gender, on the wars, on Gaza, and you see how people are protesting and sort of getting back to this feeling of we actually need to do something. This world is not going to get better if we just put our trust in institutions, including the UN. So I think that really is what will make the difference.
Thank you so much to all of you panelists and also to your audience. Unfortunately, so we don't have any time to open up for questions because it's coming to be a mingle here right now after this panel sometime. But do you have time to stay to speak with people here? Sure.
There's supposed to be an opening of this pavilion.
Yeah.
Officially at 6:30, 12 minutes. Okay. So, but you should stay around, shouldn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but thank you so much once again. So we'll hope to